Anyway, lads, good to see you, man.
Hey, man, relieved to be here.
2 weeks later, here we go.
What a week
Episode
it's been.
17.
What a
This
2
could
weeks
end
it's been.
terribly. The boys are back, bitch.
That's right.
But it's been a bit mad.
It's
been a bit crazy.
As I've said 100 times before, as Busta Rhymes said before the seminal track with Mariah Carey, there's a lot of things going on tonight.
A lot of things going on tonight. Now, for the first time in probably about 7 months now, I'm actually just going to take a fucking back seat. All I'm going to do is I'm going to say 2 words. And then I'm going to kick back.
What are they?
Israel, Palestine. I'm sitting back.
Excellent. Let's ask the Jew what he thinks about the conflict. This is
I sat back and then I looked at Johnny.
This is a unique take. I'm sure no other podcast has covered this.
We don't need to go through it. You all know what the fuck's been going on. However, we'd be remiss to not go into it. And you know, we ain't about to come in here and have Johnny speak about fucking Black Lives Matter, right? So it makes sense that he speaks about this, which is what he's going to do. And as I said, I'm going to kick back because for the first time in 17 episodes, this is going to feel fucking great to not hear the sound of my own voice, which is a problematic opinion given I'm a podcast host.
This could end terribly.
Very good.
Disclaimer.
Yes, this could end terribly. Shit, where do we start? I mean, firstly...
How do you feel? What's it been like being Jew these last couple of weeks, Johnny boy?
Yeah, I mean, it's been tiring. But to an extent, how I feel kind of isn't really important in the grand scale of what's going on over there. It's just awful. It's awful. It's an awful tragedy. It's an awful civilian tragedy. It's an awful humanitarian tragedy. It's an unnecessary conflict. It's an asymmetric conflict. It's just awful. As a Jew in London over the last couple of weeks, it's been difficult. It's been difficult for many different reasons. I think I'm quite lucky in that, one, I kind of didn't grow up in that Northwest London or North London Jewish bubble community. Yeah. I don't live in that area. Everyone who knows me knows I'm Johnny the Jew, but I don't really look like a bait Jew beyond like the reasonably sized nose. For people who live in areas like Hampstead and Golders Green, it's been a tough couple of weeks. There have been attacks in the street. Everyone saw this motorcade of people driving past saying death to the Jews, rape their daughters and whatnot. There's a rabbi attacked in Chigwell today. There was someone, as of recording, someone attacked a driver in Golders Green. And I know the Jews aren't great drivers, but it's no excuse. And it has been tough. It has been tiring, and you've had to see we're good at dark humor is our thing.
I just don't know what I can and can't look. Anyway,
we're a people of jokes. It's been tough, but what's also been tough is honestly seeing the volume of shite posted, seeing the volume of misinformation, of inaccurate information that people have been posting all over Instagram and Twitter. People, your own friends who either are misinformed, ill-informed, or 100 different reasons. There has been a lot of shit going on.
What would you say some of the bigger kind of pieces of shit or bad information that's going around?
But before we do that, maybe give a balanced account of what's going on, and then lead up to why the misinformation is being spread. What information, as Tommy just asked, is the worst at the moment?
So, all right, we'll try and do a crash course in 3 or 4, 5
let's
minutes.
Try. Let's just try. It's not a simple topic, right? So we're going to try and do this.
We've got to give this one justice a little bit. So the genesis of the wider conflict and why it's happened more recently. So this all goes back to kind of really the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s. Lots of Jews at the advent of Zionism felt that what was then Ottoman Palestine, the old Israel, would be a safe place, a place of refuge, given there were pogroms and anti-Semitic activities in various places across Europe. At the same time, the Palestinian territory within the Ottoman Empire started to see itself with a more national identity. They didn't see themselves as Arabs in the same sense that Iranians don't see themselves as Arabs, in the same sense that certain parts of Syria, especially Kurdistan, don't see themselves as Arabs. They developed a specific national identity. And so as Jews started moving to what was Ottoman Palestine, there was a generally peaceful coexistence under Ottoman rule, but there were tensions developing as this kind of new nationalist Palestinian identity merged with an influx of Zionist Jews fleeing Russia, France, and other places. Then we got World War One and the Ottoman Empire fell apart. So my book that I keep telling everyone to read, Line in the Sand by James Barr, goes through the story of how the British and the French carved up what was the old Middle East, the old Ottoman Middle East, into two areas. And so the British took over the mandate of Palestine, what was known as the Palestinian territory of the Ottoman Empire. And then more and more Jews kept turning up for the same reasons, rising anti-Semitism in Europe, etc. There was also a more organized movement for a state of Israel to be created. We started seeing kind of Jewish resistance fighters preaching the cause to fight against the British to create a state of Israel within British Palestine. Then World War II happened. The British couldn't really afford to hold this land anymore because the empire was totally fucked. The country was bankrupt. So the United Nations divvied the land into two. They said there's a bunch of land here for Palestine, a bunch of land here for Israel. The Israelis agreed. The United Nations voted on it. The Arabs disagreed. And that was the first Arab-Israeli war, 1948. What happened was the Israelis won that war and they ended up taking over a lot of land that had previously been designated to the Palestinians as per the post-World War II UN declaration. Yeah. Okay, so then fast forward a little bit, we get these sporadic attacks and we end up in the 1967 Six-Day War, where a six-nation coalition goes to war with Israel and it ends pretty badly. That did end terribly for the Arabs, and most notably for Palestinian citizens, because Israel ended up taking over all of the territory that had previously been given to the Palestinians, as well as the Sinai Peninsula, which is kind of the bit of land between Israel and Egypt, or kind of like the eastern bit of Egypt. Yeah. And then what happened was further conflicts going on, etc., etc. We had the rise of Arab nationalism during the 60s and the 70s, and that led to Jews being expelled from other places in the Middle East. And so in the same sense that a lot of Palestinians were moved out of what was Palestine, Israel, in the 40s and again in the 60s, Jews were effectively kicked out of countries like Morocco, Algeria, Iraq, Syria, and they had to flee to Israel. And that's how you had this kind of increase in population of Mizrahi, Maghrebi Jews in Israel. Yeah. And then you end up with the 1978 Oslo Accords, which basically the 1978 Camp David Accords, which was the deal which kind of gave the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt. But the Arabs were so pissed off with Sadat for agreeing this deal that they assassinated him, which wasn't ideal. And so there was further Arab League or Arab nationalist tensions against Israel. And then we get to the Oslo Accords in the early 90s under Bill Clinton. And there was a divvying of the land, also not a great deal, but it was meant to be a starting point where there was portions of land within what used to be the 67 agreed borders, where in certain parts of Palestine, Palestinians had full control. There was joint control in another area, and then it was all under Israeli control. Now that third bit, section C, is important to remember. We're going to come back to it. Then we had various intifadahs, which means uprising in Arabic. This is where you had popular revolts against the Israeli occupation. The name, you may have heard this phrase, Israeli. It goes back to Israel winning the 67 war and taking over these lands. And the conflict goes on and on and on, kind of in perpetuity. There are later intifadas. The second intifada ends in 2005. The Israelis give back Gaza. But the problem is that during this time, Israel consistently sends settlers to live in that third section. So where there was a defined Palestine with three different systems of government, full Palestinian control, shared control, and Israeli control, Israel has been sending people to go and live in the bit that's under Israeli control.
Why?
Because it's their method of normalizing, expanding Israeli territory into that Palestinian area.
Whose method? When you say their method,
it tends to be far right or nationalist Israeli governments. It tends to be the Likud party. In general, this is who Netanyahu's representing. So we end up in a situation today where we basically had an unfortunate coincidence of the calendar, where the last week of Ramadan coincided with Yom Yerushalayim, which is Jerusalem Day, that celebrates the day in 1967 when Israeli forces recaptured East Jerusalem.
Right.
It's the first time in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years that Jerusalem had been a single city under Jewish control. So that's always a day where the nationalists and the far rightists in Israel come out to celebrate Israeli pride and fuck the Arabs kind of shtick. Coincided with the last week of Ramadan. Obviously not good timing.
Of course.
Obviously not good timing. And so tensions have been mounting, escalating. Both sides been going tit for tat, tit for tat. In that history of Israel Palestine, what I didn't mention was that the West Bank, as it's called, which is kind of the east of Israel, it's called the West Bank because it's on the west bank of the River Jordan. It's controlled by Fatah, the old Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, and the Gaza Strip is run by Hamas. Now, the reason that Israel justifies basically fucking the Palestinians constantly is because they consistently conflate Palestine with Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization. They took control of Gaza and they haven't really allowed any elections ever since. It's bang wrong for Israel to conflate them, especially when Jews in this country and Jews all over the world ask not to be conflated in our identity with the policies of an Israeli government. It's totally abhorrent. And without going too deep into why Fatah is no longer really an effective political institution, what Hamas does in the Gaza Strip is not relevant to how Israel treats Palestinian citizens in the West Bank. And that's bang wrong. It's been bang wrong for a very long time. This settler program, state-sanctioned protection, where basically people go and live and then soldiers go and protect them, is awful. It contravenes all types of international agreements. And that's where this big hoo-ha is kind of the wrong word, but this conflict has come from, is because there was a specific set of families who were about to be kicked out pending a Supreme Court decision as part of this ongoing program of displacing Palestinians from Israeli-controlled Palestine. And the protest kicked off, coincided, bad calendar timing, etc., etc. Boom. A region that is a perpetual tinderbox caught fire.
Yeah.
What would you say some of those kind of the misinformation going around at the moment?
So there's been a particularly popular infographic that's been going around. The two ladies sitting next to each other makes claims such as Israel doesn't exist or it never exists, has no international right to exist. It discredits the presence of Jews in that region recently and or historically. Agreed that Israel it's an asymmetric war in terms of how they fight the Palestinians, who basically throw rocks and Israel shoots back with bullets. It totally misrepresents the fact that Israel was attempted to be invaded twice in 1967 and subsequently the Yom Kippur War. Had the Arab coalitions successfully invaded Israel, there would not be an Israel today. It's a totally hypocritical view of looking at the conflict. And it also misuses and popularizes quite sinister phrases, in my opinion. People might disagree with this, but expressions such as, well, you may have seen from the river to the sea, which is an expression about Palestine. Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. Is basically an expression of Israel having no right to exist, that we should clear everyone out, and that
You're saying it's
from
quite widespread?
Yes.
Is it quite widespread?
Yes, yes. The land from the river to the sea should be under Palestinian control. That was never agreed upon by the United Nations. It has never been subsequently agreed. Yasser Arafat in the PLO never agreed from the river to the sea. It was an extremist phrase that has now been kind of sanitized and popularized. It kind of goes back to something I'm going to get into later, but all this kind of semblances of performance activism on both sides, from Jews who are just arguing awful things against Arabs because they're Jews, but also people engaging in this because it's 2021's Black Lives Matter moment. People who aren't educated and aren't genuinely engaged with this are sharing misinformation because they don't understand the history of the conflict.
Yeah.
And it's tiring.
I feel you.
It's sad. Yeah, it's awful. And this is the thing, like, it is tiring. It's tiring here. It's not easy for the Jews who live in Golders Green. But again, our kind of like sensitivities and our complaints are just nothing. They're totally irrelevant. There are children being bombed incessantly in Gaza. There are people being attacked in East Jerusalem, in Palestinian-controlled East Jerusalem. There are also civilians being attacked in Tel Aviv. I know people in Tel Aviv who are spending nights and nights in rocket shelters. Yeah. The important thing to remember is that Benjamin Netanyahu has failed to win 3 elections in a row. 50% of the country.
You just call him BB.
People call him
that's
BB. It's his
nickname.
popular name. 50% of the country fucking hates this guy.
Benjamin.
Yeah, I know, but BB?
Yeah,
That's his name.
everyone calls him BB. Like even US presidents and stuff will be like, "Oh, BB Netanyahu."
That's just his nickname, right?
Young BB.
Young B.
Okay.
He's kind of old B right now.
Yeah, okay.
Teflon B. More
Teflon B. Yeah. Anyway, 50% of the country fucking hates this guy, right? And the people I speak to in Israel are kind of like, we don't understand what the fuck this is happening. This has happened out of nowhere. Why this is happening is because the only way that he can secure a government in coalition is by pandering to the far right nationalists in Israel. The last time someone tried to really create a peace deal with the Arabs was in the 80s. I think it was Yitzhak Rabin, assassinated by a far right nationalist for giving too much land. It's a problem. It's a problem. And if you go to Israel, the attitudes of Israelis towards the Arabs are abhorrent, racist, awful. And some of the arguments that you hear in this country from people say, well, Israel needs to exist because it's the only safe space for Jews. And you think, well, no, Jews aren't particularly safe now. This conflict has not made Jews safer in Israel. Clearly, they're under rocket attack.
or anywhere else, really.
It has definitely not made any of the Jews in Golders Green any safer, right? Israel does not have a right to exist just because we think that it might be a decent idea for Jews to have somewhere to escape to.
Yeah.
That might have been the idea 100 years ago. It has a right to exist because it has a right to exist under international law. I also believe because it was subsequently attacked multiple times and conquered territory. That's kind of how nation states are built and developed. But the overriding point is that it is important to differentiate solidarity with Palestine, which I think all Jews should have, all Jews particularly. And, you know, we all have our kind of racial particularities and our identities and things that we speak to. I speak to certain things as a Jew. You guys speak to certain things as a black man. As a Jew, I think it's unconscionable that Jews would not support and oppress people. Yeah. But then you also, again, going back to the point of misinformation, there have been comparisons between the state of Israel and Nazism in how they treat Palestinians. And I think that's abhorrent. I think that's a particularly nasty comparison to make. There's also been
comparisons to apartheid in South Africa.
So I think that's more, honestly, I do think that's more justified.
It's more apt.
I do think it's more justified.
I think, obviously, the whole thing is very sad. And like you said, there's people dying. If I look at this from a slightly different angle, what I find interesting is how the response to all of this has changed over time. When I say response, I mean civilian response and international community response and all the rest of it. I found there's been a slight different tone this time around, I'd say.
How so?
I think this might be maybe the first time, unless I've read it wrong, and I'm no expert geopolitically, but that Israel may be starting to lose kind of that battle for hearts and minds, as they like to phrase it. Because like I think Bibi came out and they just announced a ceasefire yesterday or whatever,
which they've already violated. Yeah,
but he came out and he said, "Look, we've achieved all of our objectives for this battle, so we're happy to do the ceasefire, right?" Mm-hmm. And I think certainly they have whatever objectives they had, whatever kind of command control centers and whatever they wanted to destroy, they've destroyed for sure. Mm-hmm. But they may have won the battle, but I think a little bit of the war they may have lost, and that armor is that kind of hearts and minds element that I think that I speak of, because obviously for the last however many years, and as you mentioned, there's been like asymmetric power, right? That asymmetric power is militarily, it's diplomatically, but also in the media, right? So there's been like some kind of unwritten rule basically where in the media you can't really criticize Israel, nor can you speak to the suffering of the Palestinian people, right? Because ultimately the only people you really expect to speak of this kind of stuff is largely politicians, and politicians will only speak to things where they see an upside, right? And there is no upside in championing the cause of the Palestinian people or whatever, right? At that time.
Which is an awful...
Sure, but that was the political reality, right?
Yeah.
The political reality of what we've seen over the last 15 years. So I think what we've seen now is that kind of stock political kind of answers don't fly anymore, right? So you've seen Joe Biden and Andrew Yang and Boris Johnson and everyone try to give that kind of stock answer of, Israel has a right to defend
bullshit,
itself,
yeah.
which of course, sure, every country has a right to defend itself, but that kind of
non-argument.
like unsophisticated, kind of
Yeah.
unnuanced view would fly before, but
Yeah.
now
Doesn't work.
it doesn't work, right? They're getting pushback to explain it. There's a myriad of alternative media, let's say, that people can broadcast to or get their news from.
Yeah.
And all of that has led to people, whether they have the full set of information or not, looking around and seeing that there's a group of people who are being subjugated, basically,
Yeah.
right? And as a collective, these newly found activists, maybe as you put it, have come out and said, nah, like we can't have this.
Yeah.
Right. And as a result, you're seeing the politicians having to find new rhetoric.
Yeah.
Basically,
Yeah.
right. And that's what I mean. And there's a bunch of stuff around what Bernie Sanders. I don't know if you read. He wrote like some New York Times opinion piece, and he said some interesting stuff. But I think what people have to understand is you have like racists, all types of abhorrent people in every country, right? So there are in here, for example, I know UK best. So in the UK, you might have the National Front or the BNP or people on the fringe left and the fringe right and
the
stuff.
Tory
right?
party.
So you have a diverse set of opinions, basically, right? The only thing is in Israel now, it's that kind of hard right opinion, basically, that has been in power for a prolonged period of time, right? With the crumbling of the left and all the rest of it. So I think, I don't know. I think it's sad, and I think Bibi's. I think it's political. All of this
is entirely politics.
Politics is local, and all of this is basically a plea, I guess, from him to stay in power, basically.
Instagram people, stop getting so mad when people don't post the things you post. Like, relax. We say this every single fucking time. These topics are important. Absolutely. Getting behind them and supporting them. I don't know how much you actually do by reposting a thing on your Instagram that only your followers see, your little echo chamber of support see, but fine, do your thing, but leave it at that. Stop alienating people. Is that fair?
Echo chamber.
Or genuinely engage. Israel has done terrible things in the last 5 years, which is the last thing I'd say,
Yeah.
They passed the nation state bill or some shit. It's a fucking awful piece of legislation. Basically said that only Jews have the right to self-determination in the land of Israel. Fucking abhorrent.
Yeah.
Reduced Arabic to a second rate language in the country.
All types of UN
Awful.
contraventions.
Yeah,
right?
all kinds of settler contraventions, all kinds of... the move to remove the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, deliberately provocative. Yeah, we could spend hours and hours, but the last thing is solidarity with Palestinians.
Swear down.
Likud are fucking assholes. Netanyahu's an asshole. Don't ask Jews to explain the domestic policy of the Israeli government because it's not our fucking beef.
Amen.
And stop anti-Semitism, stop being anti-Semitic, stop attacking Jews in Golders Green because they can't even drive, let alone direct Israeli
Also,
domestic
unchecked
policy.
They
bias.
need driverless cars.
They need driverless cars.
Yeah.
They need
But
driverless
also
cars.
keep. If you see something you don't like, say something, right?
Yeah.
That's what people are doing, regardless of
Well,
how
get informed.
or not you're informed you are. If you see something that you deem to be whatever, unchecked oppression or whatever, say
Yeah.
something. It's fine. You don't
For
have
real.
to know everything. Like, you can still say what the fuck's going on here, and then as long as you're open to be educated, cool. Like,
Yeah.
all
For real.
blessed.
For real.
This asymmetric conflict has got to stop because nobody wins. Nobody wins. But